92 elements. So the atomic number, the number of protons, defines the element as an element. If you look on the periodic table in the back of your book, nobody has the same atomic number, right? Because if I had the same atomic number, I would be the same element. We're going to see with chemical reactions as they take place, we're going to see different numbers of the other subatomic particles depending on what's going on. So hydrogen, for example, as we see up here, how many protons does hydrogen have? 1. How many neutrons does hydrogen have? None. How many electrons does hydrogen have? 1. On the periodic table, all of the elements listed there are in their neutral state. So the other thing the atomic number tells us, but only of these guys on the periodic table, does that make sense to you? It tells me what? It also tells me the number of electrons. Does that make sense? Because everybody on the periodic table is neutral. Is that the way they exist in nature? Absolutely not. Helium, if you look at your periodic table, is all the way over on the other side. How many protons does helium have? 2. How many neutrons? 2. How many electrons? 2. Now, what is the mass of helium?
4.
Yeah, go look on that periodic table way, way back in your... I know, I should have brought you one today. Another thing I forgot. It's on page... I think it's A8. Yep, on page A8, Appendix E, in the back of your book. Helium's all the way over on the other side of this periodic table. What is helium's atomic mass? 4.003, right? What does the mass number, what is, don't say that, what does the atomic mass mean? Right, but which are the ones that actually give a full atomic mass unit of weight? Protons and neutrons. So that number represents the number of protons and the number of neutrons. So knowing what the atomic number is for helium, you'll be able to figure out how many neutrons it has without a cute picture, right? By doing what? Correct. So if you subtract the atomic number from the atomic mass, and you have to only use whole numbers for your answer, so if it's point something, 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 we disregard them, that's going to tell us the number of what? That's going to tell us the number of neutrons these elements have. Now they're all lined up for a reason. And the ones we're going to look at mainly are those purple ones. They're in groups. Does anybody know what the groups represent? No. No. There's no charge on these guys. They're neutral, right? Who's a chemist in the group? No. There's my girl. The number of valence electrons is represented by that group number. What the heck is a valence electron? Well, you'll notice as we go up in number, we're going to get more and more electrons as we move along, right? So hydrogen in group 1 has how many electrons? Helium has how many? 2, so it should be in group 2, right? This is where the confusing thing comes along. It's all the way over in group 8. How the heck did it get all the way over in group 8? As I get more and more electrons, they have to move around the nucleus. they have to move around and not bang into each other. If they bang into each other, we can have some problems. Have you ever heard of an atomic bomb? Yeah, that kind of problem. So we have to keep each other, these electrons, as they orbit around the nucleus. They have to have their own space. Now the space, you see these little circles we've created, these are called orbits. The space right around the nucleus can comfortably allow 2 electrons to flow in that space. But if I have anything more than 2 electrons, where do they have to go? Further and further away so they don't do what? Smash into each other. So these electrons are going to move in a very highly organized manner around the nucleus. Otherwise, we have big explosions. Okay? So 2 electrons can fit in the first orbit. Every other one after that can house 8 electrons. So those 2 numbers you have to remember. The first one, 2. The rest, how many? 8. I'm making this very simple. It's more complex than that, because we also then have to add dimension to the picture. So when we look at the second orbital, it's got different energy levels. We're not going to go into that. We're just going to remember those 2 numbers, 2 and 8. And what all of these guys on the periodic table are striving to do is to have a full outer shell. They want their electron outer shell to be full. If I only have one shell, like hydrogen, what would make me happy? Another hydrogen that I could share with. But I want to have how many electrons? I only have one shell. How many electrons to be happy? 2. How about the other guy on the end here? Lithium. He might want 7 more. Or it might be easy for him to give somebody else that extra 1 floating around there, and he'd be happy too, right? That outer shell is going to determine chemical reactivity for these elements. The ones that have full outer shells are not reactive. They're happy. They don't care. They've accomplished what they need to accomplish. And look at helium. Why do you think he's in group 8? He's complete. He's the only exception to the rule of 8s. He's only got 1 energy level. So if he has 2 electrons, he's happy. Group 8 we call the noble gases. It's kind of like royalty. We don't want to react with any of the peons. We're nobility. We're stable. Everybody else is going to react with others in different ways to become stable. Make sense? Knowing that, what can you tell me about everybody in group 2? Anybody? You read the top of them. But what can you tell me about their electrons?
They need 1 to be there.
Nope. Let's go look at somebody. Let's go look at magnesium. Okay? I'm going to go back. Magnesium. What can you tell me about magnesium? I'm going to draw it up here. Oh, I get a fool with this. Be patient with me. Pointer options. It's hard to get back into the swing. Isn't working? Okay. So magnesium. Its a symbol name is Mg. Tell me a little bit more about it. So it's got 12 protons, and I'm going to put 12p instead of drawing all the little balls. How many neutrons does it have?
5.
How many? 12, thank you. Who got 5? How do you figure out how many neutrons it has? Look at the mass, that's at the bottom. Subtract 12 from 24, you get 12. So we have 12 neutrons, right, number 5? Makes sense? Okay, now I'm going to draw the electrons. How many electrons does it have? It has 12. How'd you know that? You didn't subtract anything. It's the atomic number, too, right? All right. So 1, 2. Where do the rest go? Next ring. How many can I fit there? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's all that can fit. Where the other ones go? I still have 2 more. You getting the point? So what's the group number tell me? Correct. How many valence electrons? And valence electrons is defined as the electrons in the very outermost orbit of any given element. So you can do it for all of them. I'm not going to do it because it's a pain. It takes forever. But when I have electrons and I have to set them up, the first 2 are always going to go where? In the first level. The next 8, the next 8, the next 8 till I run out.
So the group number tells you how many is in the last one?
Correct. So how many does beryllium have? Be. How many valence electrons? 2. How many valence electrons in group 3? 3. How many valence in 4? 4. In 5? 5. In 6? You get the point. So that's why they're put where they are on the periodic table. Now, the ones that are in certain groups are going to be very reactive with other ones, so they can help to be stable. So when we identify elements, we should know all of the parts. We should know how to figure out how many protons, how to figure out how many neutrons, how to figure out how many electrons. Understand what the atomic number is, the mass number. And guess what? All of these guys are hydrogen. How do I know that? Because they all have what? They all have 1 proton, and that defines hydrogen. But remember I told you that's not necessarily how they're going to exist in nature. These are called what? Isotopes. They're isotopes of hydrogen. So these are the different forms that we'll find hydrogen existing in nature. When reactions take place and energy is transferred, hydrogen might gain a neutron. What do we call it? Deuterium. Tritium, if it gains 2. It can't hold on to them for too long, though. It might give them off again as energy. These guys are what? We call them radioactive, because when they give off those extra particles that they have acquired, energy is given off. And these are very low-level radioactive elements. But that's what radioactivity is. We give up energy by giving up some of our acquired particles. And that energy, depending on how strong it is what we call radioactivity. So these guys can also be called radioisotopes. Because why? They're radioactive. You with me? Do we understand all of the terms, atomic weight, atomic mass, and all of that good stuff? So the next thing we're going to find in our textbook is how matter is combined, how molecules mix together, why are they attracted to each other. They talk about something called a molecule now. What's a molecule? Combination of these guys. So they come together to satisfy each other's valence electron needs, and they form something very different, molecules. You've seen that term before. It's the next level of what? That organizational thing I was talking about, right? So atoms is the smallest building block of matter, and when atoms come together, they form molecules. Molecules can form compounds. And what's a compound? Yeah. When we start adding more and more of these guys together, again, to satisfy each other's needs, they are going to be different physically by doing that. And that's when we start talking about chemical reactions. So we see that chemistry, the formation of molecules from atoms, can form several different types of mixtures. Solutions. These are things that we talk about in lab and you prepare in lab, but they can be in many different forms. So when we talk about types of mixtures, we can see mineral water there as an example. And what's mineral water? Anybody ever drink it? It's kind of bubbly. Is it just H2O? No, what else is in it? There's some carbonation, so we've dissolved some gases in it. What else? It's mineral water. There's some minerals dissolved in it too, right? We can also have things called colloids, where some of those particles in a solution are actually floating around. Anybody ever make Jell-O? I'll refer to Jell-O many times in this class. But Jell-O is an example of what we call a colloid, where some of those particles that are formed are actually suspended in that mixture. And then we have things called suspensions, things that are sort of floating around in solutions. Your blood, for example, is a suspension. When I take blood, anybody ever give blood or have to go for blood tests? You take it out, it looks like nice red, dark magenta color. If I let that sit there for a while, you know what's going to happen to it? That. The heavy stuff, the cells in this suspension, are going to float to the bottom. And we'll actually see the different components of a suspension. In blood, for example, we have something called plasma, and the heavy stuff settles to the bottom. So do you see the difference between a solution, a colloid, and a suspension? It's just different ways of floating around in solution that some of these different molecules have. So the concentration of solutions is measured with respect to how many atoms of that substance is in my solution. Does anybody know what a mole is, besides the cute little things that like to rip up our lawn? I don't remember. It's a way to measure how many atoms or molecules of a substance is in my solution. If I want to make a solution very specific, I can use the molarity of a solution to make it. And how would I figure out the molarity of a solution? Anybody know? How would I figure out how many atoms were in my solution? My atomic weight's going to help me. Okay? If you look on page 30 in your textbook, the definition of a mole is any solution that has Avogadro's number of atoms in it. And do you know what Avogadro's number is? 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd. Is that a big number? Yes, it is. Do you wish you had that many pennies? Yes, yes. I wish that every day. So, if I want to make a 1 molar solution, my periodic table can help me. If I want to make a 1 molar solution of sodium chloride, how would I do that? How would the periodic table help me? I'd go to my periodic table and I'd find out what the atomic what? What would I do? I'd find out the atomic, not number, the mass of sodium and chloride. So what is the mass for sodium? That's the number on the bottom. What is it? 22.99, right? So what's this? The atomic mass. What's it for chlorine? Chlorine's all the way over in group 7. 35.453. Yes? Now that I know the mass of these guys, if I add them together, yes? And I want to make a 1 molar solution of sodium chloride. Guess how many grams of sodium chloride I have to add to that solution?
58.32.
That's right. So 57 point.
The number should be 58.443.
You're right. I can't add. 58.443 grams of sodium chloride into my beaker and bring the solution up to a liter. Guess how many molecules of sodium chloride I'm going to have in my 1 liter solution? 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd. So in chemistry, when you have to make up very specific solutions, you use the molarity measurement so that you can know exactly how many molecules of whatever solution you're making is in your 1 molar solution. You're going to use the atomic mass to do that. Question?
Can you say that again? What that 58.443 is that grams
Yep.
plus 1 liter?
Up to 1 liter of water.
Up to.
So I can't take, like for example, I'm going to have to make a 1 molar solution, or maybe even a 2 molar solution. Say I had to make a 2 molar solution, what would I do? Just double it. If I have to take over 100 grams of sodium chloride, which is a lot, and bring it up to a liter, can I just put a liter of water, measure it up there to a liter, and then pour all my sodium chloride in there? No, because what's going to happen? I'm going to end up with over a liter. So whatever your measurement is, you have to bring it to the liter mark after you've added it in. Question back there?
Yeah, the molarity is the 6.02 times 7.3. So
1 molar equals that. Yep.
we wanted that 1 liter
Molar.
solution.
Yeah. No. Because 58.443 grams of sodium chloride is equal to 1 mole is equal to 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd molecules of sodium chloride. Make sense? In your book, they give you an example of glucose, C6H12O6. So, C6H12, I'm not going to do the math out because it's a pain and it's right in your book. But what would be the mass of carbon? By the way, it's right on page 30. They say atomic weight. They should say atomic mass. And what's hydrogen? 1.008. And what's oxygen? 15.999. Now, how would I figure out how to weigh out 1 mole of glucose, C6H12O6? Well, there's 6 of those, yes? And there's 12 of these. And there's 2 of those. 06. I'm sorry. Why did I put 02? Maria, wake up. Oh. Yes? Then you'd get the numbers you see in the book. Add them all together. So how many grams would you need to make 1 mole or a 1 molar solution of glucose? 180.156 grams of glucose. Put it in the beaker. Bring it up to what? 1 liter. That's my 1 molar solution of glucose. How many molecules of glucose in that solution? Thank you, sir. 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd. Yes? Excuse me? Correct. When we make it in grams per liter, it's not recorded and it just tells me the number of molecules. Yeah, it's not stated as grams per liter, but it is molecules per liter is probably more of an accurate way to describe it. The number of grams of substance per liter is how we figure out that number. Does that make sense? So, oh, sugar. Everybody good with how this is done? Oh, any questions? Okay. So that describes molarity. Are we going to have to do a lot of that? Probably not, but it's important for you to understand it. Colloids, suspensions, different ways of these molecules mixing together in solution. We talk about colloids and suspensions because a lot of things we're going to find in physiology are in colloid and suspension form, like plasma, like intracellular fluid, fluid inside cells. So not everything is liquid like a mixture we see when we put sodium chloride in water. Things don't all mix that way because there's a lot of lipids. We're going to talk about those guys in this chapter too. And very large proteins that might float to the bottom of any colloid or suspension. Okay? So, distinguishing mixtures from compounds basically gives us an understanding of the differences we're going to see when we talk about the chemical world and chemical bonds. So the roles of electrons in chemical reactions. What are all of our guys here striving to do on the periodic table? Yeah, balance. They're full outer what? Full valence electrons. So helium and neon, excuse me, are they okay?
Yes.
Why?
Because their valence
Because their valences
is complete.
are complete. What group do they live in on the periodic table? Group 8. Remember, helium is an exception to the rule. It only has 2 electrons, but it's got a what? Complete valence shell. So these guys are called chemically inert because they're not very reactive with the rest of the world as far as completing that outer shell goes. The other ones, everybody else that's not in group 8, are chemically reactive elements. And what's that mean? What are they constantly striving to do?
What did you call that, a complete valence?
Yes. What are the chemically reactive elements trying to do? Right. So they're trying to fill that incomplete valence shell. And these are why chemical reactions take place. So we have to remember what a valence electron is, correct? What's a valence electron? How many valence electrons does sodium have? 1. How many electrons does sodium have? 11. How many valence electrons does oxygen have? 6. How many electrons does oxygen have? Does everybody understand that? So when I say valence electrons, I'm only talking about the ones in the outermost shell. Those are the ones we're interested in when we talk about chemistry. So carbon has 4, hydrogen has 1, oxygen has 6, sodium has 1. And all of them are striving for what? Except for hydrogen, to have 8. And that's what they talk about when they talk about the rule of 8s or the Octet Rule. And that basically describes the fact that these guys are constantly striving to fill that outer shell. So there's different ways you can fill your outer shell. There's different ways to chemically react in the chemical world. You can either give up electrons in your outer valence shell, or you can share them, or you can gain them. When I either give up or gain electrons, that type of bonding is called ionic bonding. And this typically happens when I only have a couple, 1 or 2, valence electrons to either give up or gain. When I look at my periodic table, I'm going to see sodium. Sodium lives where? Where on the periodic table? Group what? Group 1. How many valence electrons does sodium have? 1. What's going to make sodium happy? It's going to gain 7 electrons. That takes tons of energy to do. Wouldn't it be easier to just give up 1? Yes? Less energy. Where does chlorine live? Group 7. Tell me about chlorine. How many valence electrons does chlorine have? 7. What does it need to be happy? 8. So it just needs 1 more. Do you think these guys are compatible? Does anybody know what sodium chloride is? Salt. Table salt. Is it plentiful in this environment? Yeah. How come? These guys like to react with each other. We like it, but that's why there's a lot of it. Now, When sodium is sodium all by itself, it's very different. Has anybody ever seen pure sodium? If it gets wet, it explodes. Yeah. Chlorine is a toxic gas. I spread some in your environment, I kill you. They come together, you sprinkle it all over your food. Yes? Do you see what happened? When chemistry takes place, it can change not the structure, but the properties of an element quite a bit after chemistry takes place. It's not going to explode or directly kill you as sodium chloride.
So does that mean elements that are in columns 1 and 7 generally work well together?
Correct.
3 and 5 would work well together?
Correct. Very good observation. You took away my next sentence. So guys in group 1 tend to like to hang out with guys in group 7. And the type of bond they form is something called an ionic bond, where we are losing electrons, if we're sodium, for example, or anybody in group 1, and gaining electrons, if we're chlorine, for example, or anybody in group 7, to form what we call an ion. Now, when I lose an electron, am I neutral? No, I'm no longer neutral. I have a what now? I have a charge. What's my charge if I lose an electron? I have one more positive than I do negative. So when sodium reacts with chlorine in an ionic bond, we now have sodium with a positive charge. Correct. Thank you for throwing that in there. So what would happen to chlorine? If I gain a negative charge, now I have one more negative than I do positive, and I'm a negative. What do we call me now that I have a charge? Guess what we call me? We call me an ion. And the movement of these charged particles across membranes can create all sorts of interesting stuff, like a nerve impulse. So ions in the human system are very important, and ionic bonding are very important. They tend to form these structures, crystalline type structures, and many of them tend to be inorganic. What the heck is inorganic? Nope. I can break that down. Easy. Who said it? Carbon. No carbon. Is there any carbon in sodium chloride? No. That's inorganic. Anything without carbon is inorganic. So guess what organic is? Anything with carbon. Carbon has how many valence electrons? 4. Now we're going into a gray area. What does carbon need to be happy? 8 electrons. So it needs to gain 4 electrons. Is that going to take a lot of energy? What if I share? Is that going to take as much energy? Nope. So carbon, because of its valence electrons, tends to form long, long chains of what? Carbon. And when they come together, they share their electrons in their valence outer shell. What's that type of bonding called? It's called covalent bonding. So instead of giving up electrons to somebody or gaining electrons from someone in the element world, I can also share. So we stick together and we share those electrons. Those valence electrons, once we come together and form a molecule, will actually orbit around all of us. So carbon tends to form very long chains of carbon, and it also tends to form something called hydrocarbons, because who else needs another electron to be happy? Hydrogen. Hydrogen can donate. Hydrogen kind of goes in both directions as far as reactions go. It can share with others, like this hydrocarbon that it formed over here. And guess what a hydrocarbon is? It's organic because it's got carbon in it. Good. But a hydrocarbon is anything that contains hydrogen and carbon. Is water a hydrocarbon? No. Is there any carbon in water? No. H2O. So it's also what? Inorganic. Yes. So covalent bonding is sharing. And we see it quite a bit with all those other guys in between on the periodic table. Oxygen, for example. How many valence electrons does oxygen have? 6. What's it need to be happy? 8. It's got to gain 2. What if it shares 2 with another oxygen in the same boat? What are we going to form? Molecules. So a lot of these guys actually just hang out with each other. If I was able to take a looking glass and look at the air, for example, that you breathe, there's oxygen in your atmosphere, right? Most of it will exist as what? O2, oxygen molecules. How about H2? Would that make everybody happy in the hydrogen world there too? So that's how we see a lot of that stuff floating around in the environment. We can draw out all the little dots to represent electrons, or if we want to trim it down a little bit, we can also draw something called the structural formula. And the lines between the oxygens in this case are going to represent what? How many what? In this case, how many pairs of electrons are being shared between oxygen? 2. 2 lines. If I'm only sharing 1 pair, like in our friend the hydrocarbon over there, 1 line. What would 3 lines mean? I'm sharing 3.
Now, is there a way to know reliably whether something results in an ionic or a covalent bond?
Yeah, you can look. You can refer to the periodic table and see. So a lot of those outlying guys tend to form ionic. Hydrogen, because of its properties and sharing properties with carbons, can go both ways. Nitrogen, for example, likes to hang out with itself as well. Nitrogen is another gas we're going to find in your environment and tends to form molecules of nitrogen gas. How many electron pairs are we sharing with nitrogen? 3. How many valence electrons does it have? 5. It wants to always be happy with how many? 8. It's got to either gain 3 or share 3. Make sense? Anybody confused?
I am on one point. The question that you just asked about how we can tell if they like to have ionic bonds.
It depends on what's in the mix. If it's hydrogen and carbon, what do you think is going to happen?
I would think they would share.
You'd think they would share, exactly. What if it's hydrogen and chlorine? And again, I'm not going to get crazy about that. That's a chemistry class.
How do you tell though?
But what do you think might happen?
Okay. 7+1, they would just come together because the outer,
What kind of bond do you think they would form?
the ionic.
Ionic bond. So it depends on who's in the mix. Okay, that's how we would tell. So hydrogen and chlorine together is hydrochloric acid,
So if
and it's an
happens-
ionic.
If it happens to the two outer valence shell has, the two valence shells together have 8, then they would tend to just be an ionic bond.
No. If they have 8, they're going to be,
I mean,
they're
if
not going to
one
react.
has 7, they would come together and not share. They would just naturally occur that they would be an ionic bond.
Yes. And sometimes 2. We'll see magnesium sometimes will give up 2 electrons too. But I'm not going to get crazy about that, honestly. That's a chemistry class. But you should understand the different types of bonds. Ionic would be giving up or gaining. Covalent would be what? Sharing. Now sometimes we share, but we don't share equally. So, for example, carbon dioxide, which is what? Nope.
Say ionic bonds, giving up or
If I either give up or gain. So what do I form in an ionic bond? I form elements with a charge, or what? Ions. When I covalently bond, I'm still going to maintain that neutral.
And it has a charge because it
Gives up.
upsets the balance of protons.
No proton.
I mean, it upsets the charge, meaning
Electrons.
electrons.
So the distribution is different now. So if I lose an electron, what kind of ion am I? Positive. If I gain an electron, I'm a negative. Yes? And those charges are going to determine the way they react within the system as well. When I covalently bond with someone else, I can share electrons, and sometimes I don't share them equally. So carbon dioxide is what? Carbon. And how many valence electrons does carbon have? And what does it need to be happy? 8. It can share with 2 oxygens. And how many pairs of electrons is it sharing with each? 2. To form a covalent bond where all the electrons are going to equally distribute themselves through that molecule. What kind of molecule is this with respect to covalent bonding? If we share equally, we call me a non-polar covalent molecule. Now the other guy down here is still a covalent molecule. Who is this?
That's water.
H2O. Oxygen has how many valence electrons? 6. It needs what? Yeah, I can share with hydrogen. Yes? How many pairs of electrons am I sharing? 1 pair with each. But when these guys move around, what's going to happen is electrons are going to move around here a little bit more before they move here and there, and move around here a little bit more before they move here and there. And they're going to form a molecule that has sort of an unequal sharing of those electrons. And because of this, it's got a slightly negative end and a slightly positive end. We call these molecules what? Polar, because they have opposite ends.
Now, is it still covalent?
Yep. It's still covalent because I'm sharing, but see this? See that little doohickey? That means slightly negative and slightly positive. It's still, on the whole, a neutral molecule, but it's got a slightly negative end and a slightly positive end. And because of that, the molecule is going to react a little bit differently in the environment. So if I share equally and I'm a covalent molecule, I'm what kind of molecule? Non-polar molecule. If I share unequally and I'm a covalent molecule, what do we call me? Polar. Those polar molecules set up what we call electronegativity and electropositivity, and they can attract things that have a charge. Kind of like a magnet. Opposites attract, right? So what if sodium's hanging around and it ionically bonded with chlorine and it has a positive charge? Will it be attracted to one end or the other of that water? Yeah. When I want to get rid of excess water in my body, guess what I do? I get rid of sodium. So how's that going to help me get rid of water? Because when sodium moves across a membrane, it's got a positive charge. Guess who's going to follow it? Water. It's called obligatory water, either reabsorption or secretion, because water is going to follow sodium. And this is how we balance fluids throughout the body, inside cells and outside cells, following the principles of chemistry. And this polar molecule water, because of its slightly positive and slightly negative ends, can be manipulated by the removal of ions like sodium. You with me? Kind of. So ionic, polar covalent, non-polar covalent are some different bonds that we see in the chemical reactions in the human body. And this diagram shows us some examples of those. Hydrogen is another type of bond that's going to help quite a great deal in maintaining homeostasis within the systems. So it's the attraction of hydrogen to other parts of what kind of molecule are we talking about here? That's slightly negative and slightly positive. What is that again? Polar molecules. So the slightly positive end of one molecule and the slightly negative end of another molecule actually do what? They attract each other. Those hydrogen bonds are going to be very important in keeping water together. Is water important for your system? Yeah, everything we're going to talk about chemistry-wise floats around in water. Hydrogen bonds are also important in keeping very large, important molecules together. Anybody ever hear of DNA? Deoxyribonucleic acid? We're going to see that hydrogen bonds play a big role in holding that molecule together so it can keep its integrity. So hydrogen bonds in chemical reactions are going to play a big role in the way things react with each other. Because of this attraction water has to its other molecules of water, it has something called a very high surface tension. And when we went to Jackman this summer on our camping trip, we saw lots of these guys. Little water striders. Have you ever seen them? Why is it they can walk across the water? Because they don't break the surface tension. Water has a very high surface tension. If you decide to jump off, I don't know, go to Augusta. There's a big tall bridge there in Augusta. And you decide you want to go take a swim in the Kennebec. Just jump off. Go ahead. You're good. Why is that not a good idea? Yeah. And if you don't break the surface tension, it'll break you. Right? So jumping off a real high bridge into water is kind of like doing that because of water's surface tension. Did anybody watch the Olympics this summer? You see those people diving from those Chinese people, I swear.
They barely splash.
Yeah, but do you notice something? Is the water still that they jump into? Do you see the little jets on the side that are making splashes and waves in the water? Why do you think they're doing that?
That's breaking the surface.
Yeah, if they hit that water and it was nice and slick, that would hurt. It hurts enough as it is. Ask somebody who dives from tall places. But that surface tension has to be broken, otherwise it can break them. So, water has a high surface tension. One of the reasons why it does is because of those attractions in hydrogen bonds. Yes?
And it also makes it, doesn't it, so that when mosquito larvae, say, they put their larvae on the
Yeah, dragonflies too.
surface of the water, if you break that tension constantly, they drown, right?
That's why they like what kind of water?
Stagnant water.
Stagnant, still water. Yep. So, there's different types of chemical reactions. We're going to talk about them in this class. And all of these reactions, again, are driven by attraction to each other. And what determines whether I'm going to be attracted to you or not? Not necessarily a charge, but they're what?
Electrons.
Yeah, they're valence electrons. So we can have different types of reactions where things are hooked together. So if I have a sodium and a chlorine just hanging out and all of a sudden they are attracted to each other, what kind of reaction will that be? It's a chemical reaction. But when I bring things together, it's called a synthesis reaction. We're going to talk about lots and lots of synthesis reactions. And in this case, we're seeing a reaction that's bringing together building blocks of proteins. The building blocks of proteins are amino acids. And as I hook them together to form big chains of amino acids, I form a protein. So this type of reaction is a synthesis reaction. Who didn't eat breakfast this morning? Nobody will admit.
I purposely ate breakfast knowing that you would
Good. All right, so you two are starving and you're just plain going to die up there, right? No, because your body is constantly striving to have a certain amount of glucose floating around in the circulatory system, and you guys were kind enough not to give him any this morning in breakfast. You're still going to be able to get some because your body can undergo what we call a decomposition reaction. And what is that? I'm breaking apart something that's large. In this case, we see something called glycogen. And glycogen is a very large, complex carbohydrate molecule you make every time you bring in carbohydrates into your body. So when you bring in carbohydrates, you eat them. You're going to take some of them and you're going to use them to make energy. And you're going to take some of them and you're going to make glycogen. Store them for the times that you decide not to eat your breakfast. Where are you going to store them? Anybody know? Liver. Oh, if you have more, we're going to put those to fat. Yeah. But first we're going to fill up the glycogen stores. Liver, muscles are places where you store glycogen. For times when you are low in glucose and you need them, you undergo decomposition reactions to pull them apart and release them, glucose molecules, into the circulatory system. And then the other type of chemical reaction we see is where we actually take larger molecules and we switch some parts. And those are called exchange reactions. So, this is a very common one that we'll see in the body. A molecule called adenosine triphosphate. Anybody ever hear of that? ATP is going to be very useful for us in the human body. Does anybody know what I use it for? Yep. And how do I use energy? How do I use energy from ATP? I break it apart. If I break off one of the phosphates, adenosine triphosphates, I'm going to release energy. And a lot of times that phosphate may then go to a different molecule. In the case of this reaction, glucose, this guy here, picks up that phosphate, and that's actually going to help that glucose stay inside the cell. So then I can break it down in a decomposition reaction and make more ATP. Guess where that phosphate might eventually end up? Back on another ATP molecule. So when I talk about exchange reactions, I see parts of certain molecules can actually switch and go to other molecules. And this is an example of an exchange reaction. Is your mind boggled yet? So what I want you to do is I want you to make sure that you read the rest of this chapter, because I know that a majority of you didn't read it because you had to study for your quiz. So I want to pick up with patterns of chemical reactions on Thursday. We're going to finish this chapter and most likely start chapter 3. Yes? Everybody, before you go, I have to take attendance. So, where's my thing? Click. Click your clicker. Anything. Anybody who does not have a clicker, make sure you sign that sheet or you're not here. If you do not have a clicker, go bug the living daylights out of the bookstore. Yes? I will go bug them after class today. Did everybody click? There's only 50 clickers in this class? Should be 51. Somebody's missing.